Tonight we're looking at the second piece of furniture in the holy place, and that is the table of showbread. So like the golden candlesticks, there was only one table of showbread in the tabernacle, but there were 10 in the temple, 5 on the right side, 5 on the left side. And what was placed on this table? Showbread. The showbread was made out of fine flour, baked in an oven, and they put frankincense on top. And there were 12 loaves of bread that sat on each table in 2 rows of 6. And the 12 loaves of bread represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And like the lamps on the candlesticks always had to be burning, God said, "And thou shalt set upon the table showbread before me always." And the priest placed new bread every Sabbath. And so back then, when people made a covenant, they sealed it with a meal. And so the priest ate this bread, representing the 12 tribes of Israel, in a covenant meal with God, because Israel was in a covenant with God. And this bread was holy. Leviticus 24:9, God said, "It shall be for Aaron and his sons. They shall eat it in the holy place, for it is most holy unto him of the offerings of the Lord." So only the priests were allowed to eat this bread, but we know there was somebody in the Bible that ate this bread that he wasn't supposed to, and that was David. But Jesus pretty much said it was okay. And so he convinced the priest to give him that bread, and he ate it because he was hungry. And so what does this physical table of showbread represent? So the physical table of showbread represents the Lord's spiritual table that we can come to and find everything that we need. So when we were younger, my mom and Papa used to take us to London, and we used to eat at Golden Corral, and I loved it. They had everything you could want there. And so that's the way it is at the Lord's table. He has everything you could possibly want. It's a feast. And so what are some things that we can find at the Lord's table? So first of all, we can find provision. So that's what Mephibosheth found. Remember, David fetched him out of Lodabar, and it said he dwelt in Jerusalem. 37 verse 25, it says, "I have been young and now am old, yet have I not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread." I've never seen the Lord's seed begging for bread, because the Lord always provides for his people. One time he had ravens bringing Elijah bread and flesh every morning and every evening. Then back in Genesis, when there was a famine in all the lands, it said there was bread in Egypt. Why? Because God has his man there, Joseph, interpreting dreams and storing up food for the famine. And then the Israelites, his old mean brothers, had to come ask him for bread. And then another time, it said in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man named Elimelech took his wife and his 2 sons. They left Bethlehem. They went and lived in the land of Moab. His 2 sons married wives. Then he and his 2 sons died. And then his wife Naomi, she decided to go back to Bethlehem. Why? It says she had heard how that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. So God always provides for his people at his table. So we can find provision. Another thing at the Lord's table, we can find protection. Psalm 23:5, David said, "Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies." So no matter where David was, in caves, forests, Philistine cities, on the battlefield, in the tabernacle, God always provided a table for him. And no matter where his enemies were, whether it was a giant standing in the valley in front of him, whether it was a king throwing javelins at him, whether it was Philistines surrounding him, he could sit and eat in peace because the Lord protected him. Something else we can find at the Lord's table, this is a good one, we can find forgiveness. So do you remember that parable that Jesus told about that boy that went to his father and demanded that he give him his inheritance that belonged to him? And he took it, and he went out, and he wasted it all. And when he was down in the hog pen of sin, it said he came to himself, and he said, "I will arise and go to my father, and I will say, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and am no more worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your servants." So he got up, he went, and it said when the father seen him afar away off, he ran, and he hugged him, and he kissed him. And he had great compassion upon him. And he said, "Bring the best robe, put it on him. Put a ring on his hand, shoes on his feet." And listen, he said, "And bring hither the fatted calf, and kill it, and let's eat and be merry." Why? He said, "For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So the prodigal son found forgiveness at his father's table, and so can we. Then another thing we can find at the Lord's table is instruction. So do you remember that table that God set out in front of Peter in that great sheet that descended from heaven? It said there were all manner of 4-footed beasts, creeping things, wild things, fowls of the air. And a voice said, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." He said, "Oh, not so, Lord. Nothing unclean or common has ever passed through my lips." And that voice said, "What God has cleansed, don't you call common." So Peter received instruction at the Lord's table. He was taught a great lesson by the Lord. Peter said of a truth, "I perceive that God is no respecter of persons." He said, "But in every nation that he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him." And then, here's a good one. Number 5, we can find healing at the Lord's table. We can find healing. So remember that Canaanite woman, that Syrophoenician, a Gentile, a stranger to the commonwealth of Israel. She came to Jesus because her daughter was grievously vexed with the devil. And Jesus told her, "It is not meet to take the children's bread and cast it to dogs." So he was sent to he said, "I am not sent but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel." We know he came into his own, the Jews. The Jews were a peculiar people with peculiar privileges. And the Jews counted and considered Gentiles as dogs. And so she could have just turned and left, totally brokenhearted, but she had a strong faith, and Jesus was making it stronger. And so the Jews, they were sitting around the table as members of the family, and the Gentiles were under the table as dogs. And so the food was for them, and she confessed to that. She said, "Truth, Lord, yet the dogs eat of the crumbs which fall from the master's table." And so she confessed that she was just a dog, and she had no right to the children's bread. She just wanted the crumbs. He said, "O woman, great is thy faith. Be it unto thee even as thou wilt." And her daughter was made whole from that very hour. And so now us dogs, us Gentiles, we're no more strangers and foreigners, but we're fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God. Now we can receive all the privileges of the Jews, sit around his table as children of God, where we can find things like healing. And then another good one. So they're all good. We won't find anything bad at the Lord's table. But another thing we can find is restoration. So we all know that Peter, he denied the Lord 3 times. And then the 3rd time Jesus appeared to his disciples, he appeared on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And the disciples were coming in, bringing their fish. And when they got there, they found a fire of coals and fish and bread already sitting there. This was the Lord's table he prepared for them. He said, "Come and dine." So what a sweet invitation from Jesus. And he invites us to his table today. He says, "Come and dine." And so after they had dined, Jesus said to Peter, he said, "Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me more than these?" So he asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" Peter said, "Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee." And Jesus said, "Feed my lambs, feed my sheep, feed my sheep." Peter denied him 3 times. Jesus told him 3 times. He was restoring him. He was telling him, "Peter, I've forgiven you. Now go work. Now go get to work." And so Peter, he found something much better than bread and fish at the Lord's table, but he found restoration. He was restored. Then, another good one, number 7, we can find communion at the Lord's table. We can find fellowship, especially when we come to his table for communion, for the Lord's Supper, when we partake of the bread and the wine or the grape juice. And so there are foreshadows of this meal in the Bible, so this is so cool. So when Abraham returned from when he went and got the king of Sodom's people and all his goods, remember that mystery man Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, he showed up. And what did he bring Abraham? He brought him bread and wine. And Abraham partook of it. But then when the king of Sodom tried to give Abraham all his goods, Abraham said, "I wouldn't take anything from you, from a thread down to a shoe latchet." And so Abraham is illustrating the lesson that Paul wrote about years later, 1 Corinthians 10:21. Paul said, "You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils." You cannot partake of the Lord's table and of the table of devils. And so we cannot have communion with the Lord and the world. One must be renounced. And then when Jesse sent David to the palace to play the harp for King Saul, it says he took bread, a bottle of wine, and he sent them by David his son. There we have a picture of Jesus being sent by his Father into this world with bread and wine, his body and his blood. Hebrews 10:5. Wherefore when he cometh into the world, he saith, "Sacrifice and offering thou wouldest not, but a body hast thou prepared me." Then we had the Passover meal the Israelites ate their last night in Egypt. They ate the flesh of a perfect, unblemished lamb, where not a bone of it was broken. They ate it with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. They took the blood, they struck it on the lintel and the 2 side posts. And so we know the priests in the temple, they ate that bread in a covenant meal with God. But the ultimate covenant meal was ate that night in the upper room at the Last Supper. Jesus ate this meal with his disciples. And so that last night in the upper room, they partook of the Passover meal, and then Jesus did something different. So Matthew 26, it says that Jesus, as they were eating, he took bread and blessed it and brake it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And Luke, it says, "which is given for you." And so that first Lord's Supper, as the bread was being passed around, the disciples were probably shrugging their shoulders, looking at each other and saying, "What's he doing? What's he saying? What's he talking about?" But hours later, he would go and they would smack him and they would whip him. They would put a crown of thorns on his head and they would nail his hands and his feet to the cross. So there's the bread. There's his body, which was broken for us. Then verse 27, it says, "And he took the cup and gave thanks." He gave thanks. So he was saying, "Father, I thank you that I can go and do for them what they can't do for themselves. I thank you for this body and this blood that you have given me that I can go sacrifice for them." And it says he gave them the cup. And he said, "Drink ye all of it, for this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins." So the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, the Old Covenant was dedicated by the blood of animals. And so as they pass this cup, they're looking down at the wine and maybe they're thinking about all the blood of those lambs and bulls and goats that had been shed. But Jesus said, "This is my blood." So the new covenant will be dedicated with his blood. And so why do we partake of the Lord's Supper? So look at the table. It says, "In remembrance of me." And so he gave them the cup. He said, "This do ye as oft as you drink it in remembrance of me." So we do it and we think about Jesus. And so then that next year, at that next Lord's Supper, those disciples, as they gathered to partake of this meal, they probably couldn't swallow the bread because their minds went back to Calvary. And they saw his body hanging there on that cross. And then they looked down at that cup and they thought about the stripes on his back. Thought about the blood running down his head from the crown. They thought about the blood running down his body from the nail prints. And then the blood coming out of his side. And they remembered that he said, "When you do it again, you remember this." So we can't ever forget what Jesus has done for us. So this meal that we partake of is a meal of fellowship. And I can honestly say this about our church. So the best thing that our church has, other than our Lord, is our fellowship. And so contrary to popular belief in our church, the best fellowship meal we have here is not chicken, but it is the Lord's Supper meal. That's our best fellowship meal. And so look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 16 through 17. It says, "The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we being many are one bread and one body, for we are all partakers of that one bread." So we are many, but we partake of one bread, his body, in communion and fellowship with God, and we become one body, also having fellowship with each other. So these are all great things that we can find at the Lord's table, but the best thing that we can find at the Lord's table is Jesus, the bread of life. So in John chapter 6, there was a bunch of people that came to him, and they didn't come to be taught, they came to be fed. But he was going to teach them anyway. And so the physical table of showbread represents the Lord's spiritual table we are invited to come and dine. And that showbread that was set on those tables represents Jesus, the bread of life. And so they came to him, and Jesus used water to teach the woman at the well, but he was going to use bread to teach them because they like to eat. Verse 27, he told them, he said, "Labor not for the meat which perisheth, but for that meat which endureth unto everlasting life." And so the food, things of the world, they feed the flesh, but it's eventually going to perish. But all the food in the world will not take you to eternity. That's what he's trying to tell them. Then look at what they told him, verse 30. They said, "What sign do you show us that we may believe you? What do you work?" So he had just fed 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish. So was that not a sign enough? So we see how hard their hearts were. And they look at verse 31. They said, "Our fathers ate manna in the desert." So they were throwing that up to him. And so they're magnifying the miracles of Moses And they think that's what was better than what Jesus had done. And then in verse 32, Jesus tells them, well, first of all, Moses didn't give you that bread from heaven. Then he says, but my Father giveth you the true bread from heaven. So he's trying to show them that manna that their fathers ate was just a picture of him. It was just a picture of him that was coming, the bread of life. Verse 33, he said, for the bread of God is he which cometh down from heaven and giveth life unto the world. So that manna was for physical life, but he is for spiritual life. So our bodies could live better without bread than our souls could without Jesus. And manna only preserved life for 40 years, but Jesus gives life to those who are dead in sin. And manna was just for Israel, but Jesus, he said he was given for the life of the world. And then like the woman at the well, she says, sir, give me this water. Look at what they said, 34. They said, Lord, evermore, give us this bread. Then Jesus tells them plainly, he says, I am the bread of life. He that cometh to me shall never hunger, and he that believeth on me shall never thirst. So he is the bread that satisfies. Those Israelites, their fathers, they ate manna and they drank water from that rock, but they got hungry and thirsty again afterwards. But once you come and believe on him, your soul will never hunger and your spirit will never thirst again. So people's hearts long for true satisfaction, but the things of the world only leave them empty again, because only Jesus can satisfy the hunger and the thirst of the human heart. And so the priests, they ate this showbread in the temple and they died. Jesus tells them, verse 49, he said, your fathers did eat manna in the wilderness and are dead. Look at 51. He said, I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If any man eat of this bread, he shall live forever. And the bread that I will give is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. So he came down from heaven, born in Bethlehem. Bethlehem means house of bread, to give his bread, his flesh, for the life of the world. So all you have to do is come and claim that your sins were on his flesh that day, and he died for them, and believe in him and have his blood applied to your souls, and you will dwell in him, and he will dwell in you. So that is a sweet promise, and you shall live forever. Look at 58. He said, this is that bread which came down from heaven, not as your fathers did eat manna and are dead. He that eateth of this bread shall live forever. So come and by faith say, Lord, evermore give us this bread. Come and partake of the bread of life.